Hello, Clay County. Hello, Florida. Tonight, I want to try to make a short video about two things that are typically called the pillars of evolution. There's 5 of them in total, at least that I learned growing up, and that were at my last school in our last textbook in Texas. And they're covered here in our current textbook as well. I want to cover those real briefly. The first is vestigial structures, and the second is embryology or recapitulation. Vestigial structures, I'm just going to read out of the textbook. It's page 469 in our current textbook. It says vestigial structures. Not all homologous structures have important functions. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors, but have lost much or all of their original function due to different selection pressures acting on the descendant. Now, the problem with this is, number one, they assume these different ancestors, these common ancestors that are part of evolution. They say that everything came from these common ancestors. There's common descent. And what happens according to evolution is as the species change, they no longer need certain parts. And so those parts are still hanging around, but they don't do anything anymore. And so that's allegedly evidence for evolution. Well, the problem is number one, they assert the conclusion they want us to draw. If vestigial structures is evidence for evolution, they can't assume evolution. They have to get us there first before we can start talking about how this is proof of evolution. And on top of that, vestigial structures aren't a proof of anything other than the ignorance of the scientist. In Darwin's day, he posited 180 vestigial structures in the human body. By the 1990s, that list had dropped to 0. And to give you 2 examples, the human coccyx, the tailbone is what it's commonly called, is considered was considered a vestigial structure. I was born in 1975, and I was born Frank Breech, and I fractured my mom's tailbone. To this day, she still has problems sitting, and it's because the tailbone is the anchor point for a number of important muscles. Anybody who is missing their tailbone or has had damage to it finds it difficult to sit for very long because it is an important part of the human body. The other part is the appendix. The appendix for a long time was thought to be a vestigial structure, and eventually they came to understand it as part of the lymphatic system. And the argument went, well, it's such an unnecessary part that all it does is it ends up causing us problems and we end up having to take it out anyway. Well, you can survive without parts of your body. You can survive without an eye. You can survive without an arm or a leg. You can survive without a kidney or a lung. And just because you can survive and even function in society doesn't mean that that part is not necessary. So the appendix actually has a function in the lymphatic system, and I'm not going to get into the details of it. You can go look it up. But it's an important part of the human body. And so to say that it's vestigial, that it doesn't serve any function today, either somebody is just parroting what they heard and they're really ignorant about it, which again, ignorance is not a bad thing. I'm not trying to attack anybody with the word ignorance. It just means you lack knowledge. But somebody is potentially ignorant about it, or they do know that it's part of the lymphatic system, but they're parroting that old argument because they've run out of human vestigial organs and they've got to hold on to something, in which case they are being dishonest. But all vestigial structures does as a whole, when we look at animals, when we look at plants, anything that has a quote-unquote vestigial structure is nothing more than actually an expression of scientists not knowing what it does yet. Because that list has grown shorter and shorter and shorter over the years, and it isn't evidence of anything. The other one is embryology. I'm going to read this real quick. Still on page 469, embryology. Researchers noticed a long time ago that the early developmental stages of many animals with backbones called vertebrates look very similar. Recent observations make clear that the same group of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce many homologous tissues and organs in vertebrates. And then a little bit further down in bold, similar patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that organisms have descended from a common ancestor. This goes back to a picture that I held up during the speech that I gave at the school board meeting at the beginning of February. Here's the picture right now. And you can see in this picture that there's a number of animals that are held up, a fish, a turtle, a pig, sheep, and a human all the way at the end. And they try to show you in this picture that was drawn by Ernst Haeckel that there is a common development cycle where every animal undergoes all of the evolution from single-celled organism to mature gestation period, and it undergoes all of the evolutionary cycle. So a human would start off as a single-celled organism, multi-celled, and then it becomes a fish, and then it becomes an amphibian, and then a reptile, and then a mammal, some kind of ape, and then eventually a human. And you can see, allegedly, all of those different stages during our gestation period, and that's what Ernst Haeckel was trying to show. He read Charles Darwin's book, and he fell in love with it, and so he went and he did some research. He gathered information from all over the world about different stages of development, and some he looked at himself, some he gathered information from other people. There were these wood carvings of these stages of development that he was using, and he drew pictures, and he presented that as evidence of this idea of recapitulation. And it's phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, and it sounded cool. There was this rhyming thing going on, and so a number of people were buying into it, except for his colleagues. Now, his colleagues were familiar with the gestation periods of these animals. They viewed the same things. They viewed the wood carvings, they viewed the animals themselves, and the information that they had was the same that he had. And they accused him of fraud. They said that he had made those things up in order to convince people that evolution was true, and he agreed. He admitted to it during this academic trial that they had, and he said, yeah, I made it up. I wanted people to believe in evolution so bad. And so he was marked as a fraud. And what he had done is one of the things that he had done is he had taken those wood carvings, and he would take one animal and he would draw it, and then he would draw it and draw it and draw it, and then he just put different names under it. So of course it looked the same because it was the same animal. He had just put it in for the different lines that you saw. And then for other drawings, he would fake it. He would show that they were similar in the drawings when, if you actually looked at the real specimen, they weren't anything alike. One of the big examples of this is the so-called gill slits. If you look in the human embryo, you see these little slits right here in the neck, in the very top section where it looks kind of like a fish, and he called that gill slits, and those were called gill slits for the longest time. I heard about gill slits when I was in high school, and come to find out, they're not. They don't perform the function of gills. They don't do anything like a gill. They have no structure like a gill. They don't convert water into oxygen. There's none of the things that gills do were present. What you had was neck folds. A big guy like me can do the neck folds with the little creases and stuff. And that's all it is the skin developing around the human head to allow the muscle and skeletal structures to grow into that. And so that's not recapitulation. It wasn't becoming a fish first. Same thing with the tailbone. The tailbone was not a tail. It was never a tail in the human being. That bone that you see there, if you look at the actual pictures, those of us who have gotten pictures done with the ultrasounds, that little tail part there, you can't really see it in the ultrasounds, but that is the base of the spine. And that doesn't go away. It's not something that's there for a little bit and then it disappears. It's the base of the spine, and then the rest of the body grows to catch up with it. And that tail, quote unquote, that you see is the coccyx. That's the bone that all those muscles connect to that you need for sitting. So to say that this idea of embryology proves that evolution is true, that it proves common descent, it's based on fraud. And it's still based on fraud today. And the more we learn about microbiology and DNA and all of the chemicals, all of the chemistry that's going on in these living organisms, the more we learn, the more we know that it's a lie. And even some of the big names in the evolutionary arena have admitted it. You just go do the research. Apologetics Press has some good stuff by Kyle Butt that talks about how they knew that it was a lie, and it's kind of a stain on evolution that they still teach it. But for them, it's kind of a humorous thing, and it's not a serious thing. We recognize it as flat out fraud and lie because we're teaching hundreds of years worth of public school students that they came from apes, and it's just not right. So that's two of the so-called 5 pillars of evolution. I didn't want to get too long tonight. Hopefully you have found this to be enlightening, something that you can tell your friends, anybody that asks. If they talk about vestigial structures, there aren't any. If they talk about recapitulation, it's a fraud. So those are things to arm yourself with to pass along to anybody who asks. Hope you have a great evening, and more to come.